Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Today's Dietitian CE Learning Library webinar, Plant Forward Family Meals, presented by Alex Caspero. Today's Dietitian is the only independent magazine written specifically for registered dietitians and nutrition professionals. Today's Dietitian is proud to be the recognized resource for practical, reliable, and interesting information for dietetics professionals. Before we start the presentation, I have 2 points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your CPE credit, you will have to remain with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Second, at the end of the session, our presenter will be taking questions. If you have a question, please type it in the question box in your control panel, and we will try to address as many questions as time allows. Today's presentation is brought to you free of charge through the support of Simple Mills. Please note that Simple Mills provided financial support only and did not have input into the information provided in this course. Today's presenter reports the following relevant disclosure. She serves as a consultant to Hum Nutrition. She has certified that no conflict of interest exists for this program. Alex Caspero, M.A., R.D., C.L.T., R.Y.T., is owner of Delish Knowledge and author of Fresh Italian Cooking for the New Generation. As a consultant and media spokesperson, she works with companies to develop nutrition communication strategies, food photography, videography, and recipes. Her award-winning blog, Delish Knowledge, focuses on making whole food, vegetarian eating deliciously simple. Alex is the co-founder of Plant-Based Juniors, an evidence-based platform that helps parents navigate the world of plant-based prenatal and pediatric nutrition. Additionally, she is the co-author of Joyful Eating, Nourished Life, which helps others discover a happier, healthier relationship with food and their body. It is our pleasure to have you here with us today, Alex. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack, so much for that kind introduction. Again, today's topic is Plant Forward Family Meals, and we're going to be going over a lot of information this afternoon. We're going to start off with the health benefits of plant-based diets, take a little bit of a deeper dive into what exactly a plant-forward diet actually looks like, talk about some nutrition considerations for both adults and kids, and then, of course, lots of culinary applications for families. As Jack mentioned earlier, we've allowed for time for questions in this presentation, so please go ahead and ask them down in the box below, and then we will address them at the end of the presentation. So welcome, everyone. So as our presentation, our talk today is focused on how to make plant-forward meals more family-friendly, I thought it made sense to open with what a healthy diet for kids actually looks like. I know a lot of us are familiar with the recent dietary guidelines for Americans, and in 2010, they recommended that all Americans aged 2 or older consume more fruits and vegetables. And of course, this is because those foods help to add important nutrients that tend to be underconsumed. They also help to reduce the risk of heart disease, of stroke, of some cancers. And then, of course, eating more plant-based foods can help to manage weight. And I think as dietitians, we all get this. We're all really familiar with the reasoning and the rationale behind these recommendations. However, very few Americans, especially kids, actually do it. Most U.S. residents consume far too few fruits and vegetables, and there was a survey that looked at the years between 2007 and 2010 and found that 60% of kids aged 1 to 18 did not meet the recommended fruit intake, and then 93% did not meet vegetable intake. So again, the messaging is out there to consume more, but as far as practice, very few people are actually meeting those numbers. And because the benefits of eating more produce are so profound, and because childhood dietary patterns are associated with healthier food patterns later in life, I think encouraging kids to eat more fruits, more vegetables, more plants could really sort of be looked at as a public health priority. And so when we're talking today about the idea of plant-based eating and plant-forward diets, we're really going to be focused exactly on that. How can all of us eat more plants? So when we look at the eating patterns of vegetarian and vegan kids, they tend to fare a little bit better than their omnivore counterparts. There was a great survey study that looked specifically at vegan children and found that these kids had higher intakes of vegetables, higher intakes of fruits, higher intakes of legumes, and then lower intakes of things like cookies and cake and candy and chocolate than their omnivore peers. When we look at various health studies, we also see that vegetarian and vegan kids tend to have lower intakes, dietary intakes, of both cholesterol and fat. They tend to have lower overall cholesterol levels, and then on average, lower BMIs. And these health outcomes are pretty consistent with what we see in vegetarian and vegan adults. And so again, I think the takeaway is that there are so many benefits of consuming more plants that as dietitians, we can hopefully help to encourage everyone to eat more of these plant-based foods, especially for kids, where again, these lifelong dietary habits are really established at a young age. And then just sort of further highlighting what we find in the research, vegetarian-style eating patterns have been associated with a whole host of improved health outcomes. I've listed some here: decreased risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, some cancers. Of course, a fiber-rich diet also promotes a healthy gut microbiota, which is linked to improved immune support and digestive health. So just sort of painting the picture that there are lots of reasons to consider eating this way either some of the time or most of the time. How many people actually are eating these types of diets? Well, the truth is that research and sort of those numbers really varies widely. And I think that's because of how the questions are framed when we're asking people about their diet types. So, for example, someone might identify as eating plant-based when asked if they're eating plant-based, but they might respond no if they're asked, are you vegan? Additionally, vegans might respond no to questions around vegetarianism or eating eggs and milk, and then not be counted as a separate population group. So it's hard to really figure out, exactly what part of the population is even interested or moving in this direction. But truly, I don't think for this presentation or any of the information that we're going to cover here this afternoon that labels matter at all. So I'm not going to focus too much time on kind of defining them and what they are and how they are the same or how they are different. I do think that labels like vegetarian and vegan and plant-based might be helpful for some people in helping to create an identity. They also might be helpful for certain individuals to have a framework of what they want to include and what they don't want to include in their diet, but you don't have to label yourself to see any health benefits. And again, I just don't see any reason for doing that for our purposes here today. I do want to highlight, too, that in some of the health outcome studies that were shown on the previous slide, not all of those participants were fully vegetarian. So, even including some animal products while also filling up on more plant-based foods is going to see improved health outcomes. So the message does not have to be all or nothing. It just should be, how do we encourage all of us to consume more plant-forward meals? The most widely cited survey on plant-based eating trends does come from a Harris poll, and this was conducted by an organization known as the Vegetarian Resource Group. And when looking at vegetarian use, they found that about 2 million individuals ages 8 to 18 identified themselves either as vegetarian or vegan. And I think that this just sort of shows there is a growing interest and a growing trend in eating this way. So then, what exactly is a plant-forward diet? A plant-forward diet, sort of how we're looking at it here, is one that is heavy on fruits. It's heavy in vegetables. It's heavy in whole grains and legumes. It's rich in seeds and nuts. It's minimally processed, and it has either low or none animal foods. And I just sort of want to obviously point out, too, when I'm using the term processed, I'm kind of using that as what we traditionally consider to be processed foods. So items that are high in refined sugars and saturated fats, like chips or soda, cookies, snack cakes. I'm not splitting hairs on the term processing and using that to create healthful foods. A plant-forward diet is, of course, also high in beneficial nutrients like fiber, in vitamins, minerals, phytochemicals, healthy fats, and then lower in nutrients that we either want to limit or reduce. So items like saturated fat, cholesterol, sodium, and then also in certain toxic things that are formed when either cooking, curing, or processing meat. And here I'm specifically talking about heterocyclic amines, or HCAs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, and then nitrates. And if you're not familiar with what these two terms are, heterocyclic amines are really not found in significant amounts in foods other than meat that's been cooked at high temperatures. And then polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are found in other smoked foods, and then they're also found in cigarette smoke and car exhaust fumes. And the reason that this matters is because in laboratory experiments, we've found that both of these compounds have been found to be mutagenic. So just meaning that they're able to cause changes in DNA that may increase the risk of cancer. This is a gray area, and I'm definitely the first to admit that. You know, it's hard to really link what we're seeing in animal studies and prove that as something that's going to be cancerogenic, but it's something to definitely address. When we look at studies that use detailed questionnaires to examine participants' meat consumption and cooking methods, we do find that people who have high consumption of well-done food, of meat, of fried meat, of barbecued meat, those were all associated with the increased risk of colorectal, of pancreatic, and of prostate cancer. Of course, in full transparency, there have been other studies that have found no association with the risk of both colorectal or prostate cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has also determined consumption of red meat to be probably carcinogenic to humans. And again, that's based largely on the data that we see from those epidemiological studies, and then also on the strong evidence from those mechanistic animal studies. Either way, I just think that there is enough evidence to want to limit intake of processed meats and, of course, the health benefits of adding in more plant-forward items. So before we get into the culinary aspects of this presentation, I do kind of want to briefly go over nutrition as it relates to plant-based kids, because there definitely are specific concerns that need to be taken into account when we're talking about eating plant-based diets for infants and children. I also want to start out by saying that the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics does say in their position paper on vegetarian and vegan diets that a well-planned vegetarian or vegan diet is absolutely appropriate for all age groups, and that does include, again, infants and children. And if you've ever counseled families or children, then you know that regardless of diet type, there's usually always room for some type of improvement. You know, when I work with clients on feeding mostly plant-based kids, I really tend to focus less on macronutrients and more on ensuring that we're meeting specific food groups. And a lot of that is because plant-based foods, of course, are combinations, right? So for example, beans are going to contain both carbohydrates and protein. Nuts are going to be primarily fat, but they do have smaller amounts of protein. And I just think it's easier for parents to be able to focus on looking at a plate model and making sure that their meals have combinations of all of these items, rather than saying making sure to have a fat, carb, and protein at every single meal. So I look at the plate and divide it by 3. And so I want to include a section for fruits and vegetables, a section for nuts, seeds, and legumes, and then a section for grains and starches. And dividing the plant-based plate this way is really going to help to focus that you're ensuring that you're meeting those requirements that are going to be needed for growing plant-based children. When we talk about nutrition concerns for plant-based kids and really for kids in general, we also want to make sure that we're focusing on fat. And that's because, of course, fat requirements for kids are different than for adults. Dietary fats are necessary for so many things. They help the body build cell membranes, allow for normal blood clotting and muscle movement. They help the body absorb certain fat-soluble nutrients. And then, of course, fat is going to be that valuable energy source that's really important for developing kids. This topic tends to come up when we're talking to parents or talking to families who follow more of a traditional whole food plant-based diet. Those diets tend to be very low in added fat, and usually completely absent of any kind of added oils. And we can debate whether or not that's a healthy choice for adults, but for kids, it's definitely not. We want to make sure that the diet is rich in fat. And so if you're starting to counsel these types of families, really having the conversation of why we need fat in the diet and why those requirements for kids are going to be different than those for adults if that's something that you're finding in that community. For kids younger than 2, fat should be about 35 to 40% of the diet, and then older toddlers and young kids need a little bit less, about 30 to 35%. Encouraging consumption of high-fat foods is what I recommend doing for most meals and snacks. Again, whole nuts and seeds can be a choking hazard until about age 3 to 4. So using thin slices of nut butter, using peanut powder that's stirred into oatmeal or smoothies, using avocado liberally, and then cooking foods in plant-based oils. These are just all ways to help to encourage healthy fat consumption in growing kids. We're going to go into much more detail on the link on vitamin C and iron in a few slides, but just sort of the reminder that we want to encourage pairing of these to help to maximize absorption. And then supplementation when needed, which I think is sort of good advice for anyone. The only one I typically recommend across the board is B12, and that's unless the diet, of course, is rich in fortified sources. Vitamin D is going to be needed for all breastfed babies, and then perhaps into toddlerhood as well, and then the need for potential DHA and EPA. Whenever I bring up the idea of a predominantly plant-based diet for kids, I tend to get most questions around calcium and iron for good reason. You know, these are nutrients that tend to come up in conversation for any growing child, but especially in areas where we feel like the diet might not naturally be really rich sources of it. And I think we often associate calcium with milk, and the thought is, okay, if I remove milk from the diet, where am I going to get the calcium? And plant-based foods are excellent vehicles for delivering calcium to the body. Beans, greens are both rich sources of calcium, and unlike dairy, they come packaged with other vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients that can help to benefit health, but then also improve calcium absorption and utilization. The reminder, of course, that calcium is a mineral found in the ground, which is why plants that are grown there help to contain calcium. Cows then eat these calcium-containing plants, which is why their milk contains calcium. So we're just sort of acting as almost the cow in that situation, eating those calcium-rich plants. I also like to bring up the conversation of osteoporosis when we're talking about calcium, especially as it relates to adults and then also to kids. So when we talk about osteoporosis, we're really not talking about a calcium deficiency disease. It should really be better described as bone atrophy. As an adult, our strong skeleton depends a lot more on preventing the loss of calcium than it does eating or drinking greater amounts of it. We know several studies that show high calcium intake really doesn't appear to lower anyone's risk of osteoporosis. There was a great Harvard study that looked at male health professionals and female nurses, and they compared those who drank none or less than 1 glass of milk a week for those who drank 3 or more. And they found that those who didn't drink much milk really were at no greater risk of breaking a hip or forearm than they were with those who drank more. And there's multiple other prospective studies that look at this. Again, not really finding a large association between calcium intake, especially from milk, and fracture risk. The suggestions, of course, are then to focus on ways to preserve calcium stores, as calcium-losing habits tend to be more harmful. So that includes things like tobacco use, alcohol consumption, high intakes of animal protein, sodium, and then a lack of both exercise and sun exposure in the form of vitamin D. So I think when you're counseling plant-based families, especially for adults, The recommendation should be making sure you're getting adequate calcium in the diet from plant-based sources, but then also trying to have a calcium-preserving lifestyle. For kids, it's easy to get enough calcium, vitamin D, vitamin K, all nutrients that are needed for strong bones. Vitamin D can be found in fortified non-dairy milks, just like it is in cow's milk. And then, of course, vitamin D can also be found in sunlight exposure or in supplements. Vitamin K is found in some of the same leafy greens that contain calcium. And I do sort of want to talk a little bit about what types of leafy greens are better, because some are great sources of calcium and some aren't. Oxalates are compounds that are found in leafy green vegetables like beet greens, Swiss chard, and spinach, and that's going to inhibit the absorption of calcium. So these foods are delicious and definitely should be included in the diet, not really considered to be a good source of calcium. Instead, focusing on things like tofu, bok choy, kale, and lentils. And if you're interested in any sort of family-friendly recipes using especially these greens, make sure to follow the Plant-Based Juniors Instagram page. We have quite a few ideas for adding more greens into kids' diets. And then lastly, the calcium in fortified non-dairy milk alternatives is usually at a similar level to that found in milk, and the bioavailability of that calcium is the exact same as that found in milk. I also just kind of want to briefly touch on iron, because iron can be a topic of concern for many parents, and rightly so. You know, the estimates kind of vary, again, depending on what survey and study you're looking at, but about 8% of children and infants are iron deficient, and that's whether or not they eat meat. So this is a problem that we're seeing across the board, not necessarily just for vegetarian and vegan kids. In fact, the rates for omnivores and vegetarian and vegan kids for iron deficiency is about the same. And then, of course, when these deficiencies do occur, the recommendation is to add a supplement, not to increase meat consumption. Iron is found in many plant-based sources, and while it is less bioavailable, a small serving of a vitamin C-rich food, so think a glass of orange juice or a half cup of cauliflower, this pairing has been shown to increase non-heme iron from plant foods by about 4 to 6 times, which is huge. So really encouraging that pairing of an iron-rich plant-based food and vitamin C. Things like lentils, tofu, tempeh, beans, quinoa, oatmeal, nuts, seeds, fortified cereals. These are all great sources of plant-based iron sources, and just making sure to regularly add them into the diet. Additionally, I think it's a good idea for all kids, again, regardless of diet, just because of the statistics here, to be tested for their iron status about every 6 months. And the last nutrition consideration to just consider is the idea that, you know, B12 is the only nutrient that is not going to be adequately obtained from a natural whole food plant-based diet. So we need to make sure that families are either providing some type of fortified source, a reliable source every day, or supplementation. And I just think because the diet intake is going to vary from day to day, it's likely easier just to have a supplement just to ensure that kids are getting this essential nutrient. But do know that most plant-based milks are going to be fortified with about 30 to 50% of the RDA for B12, and that's just in a single cup. So kids that are drinking 2-3 glasses of fortified soy milk a day are probably going to get enough B12, and then again, likely don't need any kind of supplementation. B12 drops are easy to find. They're economical. They can be mixed into water, into milk, or just taken by itself. Okay, so if you're not familiar with this plate model from the Harvard Medical School, it's a really great free resource and one that I tend to use often. I kind of shared a few slides back on how I approach the plate model when I'm talking with plant-based families, and really encouraging sort of those different subgroups and how we incorporate that into food, which we're going to talk about in a moment here. But the Healthy Eating Plate from Harvard is also a really great model. What I like about it is that it gives examples of what these healthful food groups actually look like, and it offers in healthy oils, and then it also gives the option for water instead of dairy, which again is going to be a much more appealing conversation to someone who's looking to follow a plant-forward or a plant-based diet. So let's talk about the barriers to plant-based eating, and if you're seeing things that aren't on this list, I'd love to hear it in the questions too, so hopefully we can address some of them at the end of the presentation. The one I hear almost across the board every time is, I don't know what I would cook. You know, we're unfamiliar with these kinds of foods, especially if we're so used to cooking meat or making meat the centerpiece of the diet. It can be hard to think about, well, what does that dinner look like when meat is off the table? And I think just like with anything, the only way to really overcome this barrier is to get in the kitchen and start cooking. There are hundreds of thousands of cooking videos and recipes available out there. And I usually recommend starting with something simple. You know, the first time you try tofu, the easier the better, just as you start to get a handle on what it is and kind of what its properties are and how you want to cook it. So something like a baked tofu, or taking tempeh and making it into simple tempeh crumbles. Again, simple items before moving on to more advanced preparations. For adults and kids, I hope we've kind of, addressed the nutrient concerns and reassured you that it is easy to get these nutrients, especially protein. In our protein-obsessed culture, we tend to align protein with meat. But again, protein is found in abundance in so many plant foods: tofu, beans, tempeh, lentils, soy milk. And, for kids, the recommendation for protein is actually fairly less than we might think. For a 4-year-old, it's going to be about 15 or so grams of protein per day, and that's easily met in just 2 glasses of soy milk alone. So we're not too concerned with protein intake when it comes to plant-based kids, as long as they are getting those items in their diet. Attitude is everything. When preparing new foods, just like with omnivore meals, some things are better accepted than others. There are so many health benefits in adding in these plant-forward items that I think starting slow and then incorporating a few meals here and there is a really great way to warm everyone in the family up to these items, especially if they're new. The first time that you offer tofu to your family, make it something that's going to be easy, recognizable, and appealing. This isn't the time to break out, the tofu souffle or something that's going to be really unappealing at the get-go. Start with family-friendly items. Things like lentil tacos, lentil sloppy joes, black bean quesadillas. This picture here is my barbecue tofu sliders. Again, things that aren't going to be too sort of off the wall as one of the first foods we introduce. Just like you counsel anyone on any kind of new dietary pattern, stock the pantry. Make a plan. So create recipe ideas with your clients. Allow them to feel really successful right from the beginning. So have them stock the pantry, not only with those plant-based foods that they're already familiar with, but then give them ideas on what to do with them. What we don't want is someone to go out and buy, let's say, a thing of black beans or lentils, and then it just sort of sit in the cabinet because we're not sure exactly how we're going to prepare them. So giving them a roadmap to success. I think the biggest misconception about plant-based eating is that it's limiting, but I actually find the opposite to be true. When I work with my meat-eating clients, I think that a lot of them kind of rely on the same meals over and over again, right? So considering dinner as, do we want to have beef tonight, chicken, pork, fish, and then perhaps adding in a few sides to round out the dinner plate. But when you take that option away, it kind of opens up this creative thinking to say, well, what do I want for dinner, right? What kind of foods am I in the mood for? And removing that meat allows, I think, to really sort of expand our creativity when it comes to the question of what's for dinner. Ethnic foods are a really great way to get started. A lot of these items are naturally or easily plant-based. Consider items like Indian dal, Thai curry, soups. You could do a Mediterranean hummus and vegetable platter, falafel, really so much more. So just sort of getting out there and thinking creatively about the question of what's for dinner. Okay, this is my favorite topic, and that is how to tofu. I teach a few cooking classes here in St. Louis, where I live, and I think probably hands down the most popular topic is what do we do with tofu? This can be scary to so many people, especially if you haven't had it prepared correctly. So really helping to give clients, foolproof ways of making tofu taste delicious. If you're not familiar, tofu has quite a few different options available, and depending on what you're going to make, you want to make sure that you're picking the right one. Silken tofu is usually found in shelf-stable packaging. It sometimes is found in the fridge section. And just like it sounds, silken tofu is great blended. So consider it as the base for dressings, sauces, puddings. If you're trying to boost calcium or protein intake, this is a great one to add into smoothies. The beauty of tofu is that it doesn't have a lot of flavor. So you can add silken tofu to things and you're not going to have any kind of off taste because whatever else you're adding to it is going to mask that. Baked tofu is just pre-made tofu in different flavors. So you can buy this in different kind of sauces. You can slice it and add it into sandwiches. You can cube it and add it to stir fry. Personally, I think making your own baked tofu tastes better than the items you normally get into the stores. But the great thing about pre-baked tofu is that there is minimal prep required. Extra firm and firm are likely the most popular options when it comes to tofu. This is the package that you're going to see in the refrigerated section of the store, and it's likely in the produce section. The thing about tofu, again, because it's flavorless, you'll need to press it first. And so all that means is wrapping the tofu, removing it from the package, and then wrapping it in a paper towel or a dish towel, and then setting something heavy on top. So I usually do my cast iron skillet and perhaps a few cans of beans and let it sit for about 10-15 minutes until some of that water tends to come out. This does two things. So removing the excess water is going to allow the tofu to become crispier when it's cooked. It's also going to allow for that water displacement. So if you want to marinate the tofu, it's going to absorb that flavor where the water once was. So you're able to, again, because tofu tends to be flavorless, you can really adapt it to whatever kind of flavors and spices you want to cook with for that meal. I'm going to share with you my easy baked tofu. This, I think, is, again, one of those like foolproof recipes and is really versatile in a lot of different recipes. So you'll want to press the tofu and then cube it. And then you'll toss a little bit of olive oil, soy sauce, cornstarch, and then whatever kind of seasoning you want. The cornstarch is optional, but the beauty about adding cornstarch is that it allows the tofu to become extra crisp. Then you'll put this on a baking sheet in a single layer, bake it at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for about 25 to 30 minutes until crispy. And again, it's great added into salads, stir fries, really any place you'd want to enjoy baked cooked chicken. You can add in these tofu cubes. Okay, soy healthy. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't include this slide, as I think it still tends to be such a topic of confusion. And that's, true for both parents and even for us dietitians. The common myths I tend to hear often is that soy causes feminization in men, that it may affect fertility, and that it increases breast cancer or other types of cancers. And all of these are myths. That's not true. Epidemiological research in both Asian countries and the United States shows that women who consume soy not only have lower rates of breast cancer, they also have lower risk of cancer reoccurrence, and that's regardless of their hormone receptor status. They also show that the earlier women begin consuming soy, the better. There's a lot of research that shows early consumption of soy is not only more beneficial, but it tends to be more cancer protective than those consuming soy later in life. So this is why I not only consider soy to be safe, but I also recommend at least one serving of soy foods per day, especially for young girls. I admit that the field of soy research is fascinating, and there's a lot of information to dive into, but, for brevity of this presentation today, I just sort of want to reassure that the clinical data doesn't show any effects of either soy or soy isoflavones on testosterone, on estrogen, or on semen if we're talking about fertility. And so if you and your clients are concerned at all about genetically modified soy, which again is another thing I hear fairly often, rest assured that all organic soy is going to be non-GMO. In fact, I think that most of the soy in the grocery store is going to be non-GMO, organic soy. So when you're looking for soy milk, for tofu, edamame, if you're concerned about GMO, then you can easily find organic options or options that are labeled non-GMO. And most producers are, they want you to know that. So if they're using those items, they're going to make sure to put it on the label. We kind of talked about this a little bit previously, but just sort of the reminder that the protein requirements for vegan and vegetarian children and adults is very easy to meet as long as we're eating sort of a varied plant-based diet. Kids, again, don't need as much protein as we might think. About 0.45 grams of protein per pound of body weight is all that's required. So for a 30-pound toddler, that's only about 14 grams of protein a day. You can see here some plant-based sources listed. Again, things that are fairly easy and often easy to consume in the diet to easily meet that 14, that 20, or that 35-gram recommendation. So I started off this presentation talking about why we need to eat more plant-based foods. So how do we do this? And I think this is really sort of where we take the science and where we apply it to the culinary aspect. Because as we all know, we can know the recommendations, but putting it into practice is really where the benefits start to happen. And so I think this is our sort of unique opportunity when we're talking with clients is really figuring out how do we make these foods enjoyable, how to make them things that we want to be eating over and over again. This is not about turning everyone vegan or even vegetarian. This is really about encouraging consumption of more vegetables, more fruits, more legumes, and then, less meat, especially meat that is processed or red meat. And to do this, I think we should be creating some simple plant-based family recipes. And I like to always consider foods that are already accepted. I think that's sort of the best kind of gateway introduction to vegetarian eating. My in-laws are meat and potato people. They're farmers in upstate Wisconsin. And I know when I'm preparing dishes for them, it needs to be familiar. This is not the time I can break out some crazy kind of vegan dishes. And the beauty is that they already love certain plant-based foods. They just don't think of them as plant-based. So items like a vegetable stir-fry, pasta primavera, lentil soup, again, things that are going to be commonplace to the diet already and not going to feel so out of it when we're starting to adapt these choices. Fake meats are delicious. And I think they're a great way to swap out meat for some recipes, but, they aren't accepted by everyone taste-wise. And I think sometimes relying too much on mock meats or fake meats can make some clients feel like they're missing out. So if they're interested in trying mock meats, just remind them that not all of them are created equal. Some are much better than others, and to kind of taste test around and find the ones that they enjoy the most. Start with one meal a day. That's a great way to kind of ease into more plant-forward eating. Many Americans are still eating a standard American diet 3 times a day, right? A really meat-heavy diet. Sausage for breakfast, turkey sandwich for lunch, having beef or chicken or pork for dinner, and really consuming more animal foods and less plant foods. So encourage, can we have breakfast be a more plant-based meal, or a lunch, or challenge families to incorporate meatless meals a few times a week. Again, slowly kind of leaning into this process. Another tip is just to plan the menu around plants. So shop for in-season produce and then build a meal from there. For example, if peppers are on sale, then make quinoa and black bean stuffed peppers. If butternut squash looks good in the store, then encourage them to make butternut squash chili. So allowing the vegetables and the produce to really help to influence the overall menu. And this is all things that we just talked about, just kind of putting it in here in a really kind of friendly, easy to talk about with clients roadmap. Step 1, enjoy, right? What are foods you already know, already like? Go there. Step 2, adapt. Choose a favorite family recipe and then give it a plant-based makeover. And then step 3 is to explore. This is the time to try out new plant-based foods, recipes, maybe trying tempeh for the first time, perhaps taking nutritional yeast and using that instead of Parmesan cheese on on pizza or pasta. So, slowly kind of building them into this way of plant-forward eating. Instead of removing the meat completely, you can also look at where you can reduce it. So, using meat more as a seasoning in the recipe and not the main focus. And we do this by just upping the ratio of plants or vegetables in the dish and then decreasing the amount of meat. Try to convert your favorite recipes, swapping in either legumes or vegetables for meat. So, for example, trying in eggplant bolognese instead of using ground beef, trying in lentil sloppy joes, or perhaps doing zucchini and corn tacos instead of turkey tacos. Plant-based dairy products are also great. And, really for most dairy recipes, non-dairy beverages are going to be easy to swap in. Personally, I like to use oat milk in baked goods, and that's just because oat milk is going to be a little bit higher carbohydrate content, which means it's going to brown better than other non-dairy milks. Soy is really great in recipes that call for whole milk. And then I love almond milk in smoothies and in cereal. Cashew cream is another great culinary hack. To make this, you're just going to puree cashews and water together in a blender until it's completely smooth. And again, this is going to be a really great kind of one-to-one swap. Any place you would use heavy cream, or you can use cashew cream as the base of a dressing or a really kind of rich sauce. To me, lentils are ground beef. So whenever I'm looking at recipes or I'm trying to convert family recipes that I used to love, I just tend to swap in lentils for ground beef, and it usually works fairly well. The beauty of lentils compared to other dried beans is that they don't need to be soaked beforehand. They take about 30 minutes to cook, which is fairly fast. And of course, you can also find lentils canned. You can either remove the meat completely from the dish, or you can add lentils in sort of a 1-to-1 ratio with the ground meat. So if you're making tacos, maybe we try half a pound of ground beef and then adding in half a pound of cooked lentils to try to stretch the meat, but then also, again, trying to slowly incorporate these types of foods. Consider lentils in dishes like lentil tacos. You can make lentil meatloaf, lentil meatballs, any kind of skillet meal where you're normally using a ground beef or a ground turkey. Try lentils, and then shepherd's pie is another great one that lentils easily get into. When it comes to beans, considering more than just soups and stews. Black beans and other cooked vegetables are great in tacos, in enchiladas. I like beans instead of chicken or beef in any kind of salad that the family already loves. So just taking out the cooked chicken and perhaps adding in garbanzo beans instead. Casseroles are another great place to add in beans. And you don't have to do it, again, the whole dish with beans. You can do half to half. Especially items like white beans, which are really creamy, tend to go really well into most baked casseroles. Another option is to mash chickpeas. You can do this either by hand with a fork or in the food processor, and then adding in a little bit of mayo, and then whatever kind of chopped vegetables you like. So perhaps celery, onions, carrots, and this makes a really yummy salad that's kind of similar to a chicken salad or a tuna salad. So beans are really, really versatile, and again, great source of fiber, great source of protein, and economical. Tofu is an excellent protein source, and I really think that learning how to properly cook it is a game changer when it comes to adopting more plant-forward meals. This photo that you see here are my tofu nuggets, and I've made them countless times. They're definitely a hit for kids and parents, and the secret is tearing the tofu instead of cubing it, and that's going to create that kind of jagged edge that we normally get with chicken nuggets, which not only is going to mimic the texture of meat, but also sort of that cooked taste as well. Tofu can be used in any kind of grilled kebab recipe, so consider tofu satay or tofu and vegetable grilled kebab. Tofu, especially like a silken tofu or a soft tofu, has a very similar texture to scrambled eggs, which makes it a great alternative in egg scramble and also an egg salad. So just like with those bean salads, you can crumble tofu, add in some mayo, perhaps a little turmeric for that kind of eggy color, a little bit of seasoning, and then you've got a really yummy tofu egg salad that you can use any place you normally use egg salad. Consider edamame in stir fry, in fried rice. Steamed edamame is a great snack, especially for older kids. And then baking tofu cubes, again, really work almost anywhere that you would normally do cubed and cooked chicken. And here are some plant-forward snack ideas that I think are appealing for both kids and adults. And I want to highlight these because all of these snack options are that pairing of iron and vitamin C that we talked about before and why it's just so essential. So again, iron and vitamin C together is going to increase absorption of iron by about 4 to 6 times. So really making sure that we're trying to offer these types of snacks and meals fairly often. I like the savory ants on a log. It's a celery stick, add a little bit of hummus, perhaps some diced bell pepper and chopped olives. Taking edamame and blending it into your favorite guacamole recipe not only helps to make it delicious, but also ups the protein and iron content. You can make your own granola bars and bars for snacking, and you can do this with pretty much any combination of dried fruit and nuts. I like using dates and almonds or cashews, kind of blending them together in a food processor and creating sort of a homemade Lara bar. Smoothies, again, fat is so important for younger developing kids. This is a great way to add in nut butters, to add in seeds for younger kids to really help to up that content. And then I like to make fancy crackers, and this can be a variety of different toppings. Hummus, veggies, and hemp seeds is a great combination. Nut butter, fruit chia jam, coconut shreds, and then perhaps taking some mashed avocado and sprinkling on some pepitas, which are just shelled pumpkin seeds. So lots of options, again, really focusing on the idea of pairing an iron-rich plant-based source and vitamin C. When you start to talk to clients about the idea of plant-based eating, you may hear the idea that, well, vegetarianism or eating more plant-based can be expensive. And I think that thought is popular, but it's just not thought out by the data. Meat and dairy still tend to be more expensive, especially if we're taking those dollars that we normally spend and then spending them instead on in-season produce, on beans, on grains, and not spending those same dollars on meat and dairy alternatives, because that's where the plant-based eating market tends to be a little bit more expensive. As dietitians, I think it's our role to continue to educate the idea that all forms of fruits and vegetables count, the idea that frozen vegetables are not only just as, but in some cases perhaps more nutritious than fresh, and really allowing them to figure out how do we take frozen vegetables and make them just as appealing, and really kind of helping with that culinary aspect. Same thing with dried fruit. Dried fruit tends to be a little more economical than the healthy option, and just sort of educating around the health benefits there, especially as it relates to portion size. Bulk bins are a favorite in my house, especially for specialty grains. It's a nice way to kind of try out a little bit without having to commit to a whole package. You can also save money making your own granola, making your own snack bars. These are a few of my favorite plant-based meals, and these are all under $10. for the entire meal. So things like a stir fry featuring brown rice, frozen edamame, frozen vegetables, lentil tacos, spaghetti and meatballs using those homemade bean balls, pasta and marinara sauce, and then one of my family's favorites, which are burrito potatoes, and that's taking a taking a cooked sweet potato and then stuffing it with black beans, salsa, and guacamole. And then, lastly, just sort of the gentle reminder that kids learn by examples. And as parents, as educators, that's our sort of responsibility, I think, to lead by example. Children naturally want to eat what we eat, and they can feel our excitement around foods. And, conversely, they can also feel our non-excitement to items that we're not that excited about eating. Let them get in the kitchen with you. This is especially true if you're preparing a new to them fruit or vegetable or food. Allow them to get into the kitchen, to touch it, to taste it, to smell it. Really sort of try to learn that new food or vegetable. It's going to go a long way in allowing them to want to eat it when it comes to mealtime. If you're concerned at all about timing, batch cooking is a great way to cut down on meal prep. Every week I tend to do a few batches of cooked grains and roasted vegetables, and this makes a really easy way to kind of mix and match for salads, for grain bowls, perhaps for fillings, again, and things like tacos or enchiladas. They're already cooked, and I can just pull them out of the fridge, mix and match for whatever I want to make that day. There are likely some plant-based cooking classes available in your area. So if you're not sure, you can go online and search for them. There's also tends to be online cooking classes. So this might be a great thing just to be aware of, especially if clients are asking you for this information. And then, one thing that I hear fairly often is that vegan meals feel like they're missing something. And that might be true. That missing ingredient tends to be umami. Umami, as we know, is that really kind of pleasant, delicious mouthfeel that we get when we're eating items like meat or cheese. And so when we take those things away, the plant-based diet might feel like it's lacking or doesn't have that same savoriness. So really trying to teach clients where plant-based umami sources are and how to incorporate them into the diet. So taking miso, for example, and using it in dressings or sauces. Learning to cook more with mushrooms, that really kind of meaty taste that's great in so many plant-based recipes. Tomatoes, caramelized onions. These are all sources of plant-based umami, and using them fairly often in dishes really helps to create yummy plant-based items that are going to be just as savory, just as delicious as their meat counterparts. All right. Thank you all once again for joining me here this afternoon. I would love to hear your questions, and I'd also love to connect with you offline. So I've got a few different places you can find me. My websites are deliciousknowledge.com and also Plant-Based Juniors, and then you can find me on social media on those same handles at deliciousknowledge and at Plant-Based Juniors. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start to answer some questions. We've got about 7 minutes, which is great. We can hopefully get quite a few of these responded to. If you haven't submitted your question yet and would like to do so, go ahead and do it. Okay, so I'm going to take a moment just to kind of read through here. Okay, so one of the questions here is, are DHA EPA supplements fish-based? And the answer is they don't have to be. So there are plenty of algae-based DHA EPA supplements out there. My favorite is Nordic Naturals. No association, but that's the one that I use. They have vegan DHA EPA drops, again, that is sourced from marine algae that I personally use for my baby. And then they also have both prenatal DHA EPA supplements and then ones for kids, again, that are all vegan. So whether or not the person doesn't want to consume fish or is allergic to fish, there are definitely options for supplementing DHA and EPA in the diet. The other question is, do you generally recommend a single multivitamin supplement or individual supplements of B12, D, and omega-3s? I think this really depends on the kid, and that's true whether or not, again, the diet is vegan or the diet is, sort of a traditional omnivore diet. I think for most vegan kids, if they're eating a diet that's really rich in plant foods, they likely don't need a multivitamin because they're going to be getting so many of those vitamins and minerals from plants. And so instead, they might need a little bit more cover in those items that are harder to get. So things like B12, definitely. Again, B12 is only found in animal sources. So unless you are confident that your fortified foods, you're eating them often enough to get them, I just think a supplement is probably a safer and easier way to go. Same with vitamin D. Vitamin D for most even omnivore kids is usually only found in milk, which is the same for plant-based kids if they're consuming fortified soy milks. So, making sure they're having those in the diet, or if not, a supplement is great. And same with omega-3s. The reason we talk about omega-3s is just because, as adults, we can convert the plant-based version of omega-3 to the DHA and the EPA, but there's a lot of studies that look at the conversion rate for infants and kids and find that it's just not as proficient as it is in adults. And so I think that's why, again, there's a lot of gray area out there when it looks at this topic. There's not a ton to go off of, but the few that have studied this do show poor conversion rates for infants and kids, and that's why I tend to recommend a DHA or an EPA supplement, just sort of as a cover. There's very little harm in doing so. Do you automatically recommend checking B12 and vitamin D in plant-based kids? I'm sort of the school of why not. Those lab tests don't tend to be fairly expensive. They're things that we'd want to recommend testing anyways, right? So it's just a good idea to make sure that your stores are adequate. There's a few questions here on the oxalates and calcium. And yeah, in those foods like spinach, right? Spinach is a great nutritious food, but because it's high in oxalates, we just wouldn't consider it to be a great calcium source. So we're not saying that we can't eat that food. We're just saying that we wouldn't count spinach as a calcium source. We'd instead want to make sure we're getting calcium from other foods. A note too, just besides the greens, most tofu is set in calcium, which means tofu and other kind of soy products are going to be a pretty good source of calcium. So yes, anytime you have oxalates, it's going to inhibit the absorption, and so you're not going to have that be a good source. There's a question here on the bioavailability of plant-based foods to dairy. I don't have the exact chart here on the different ones and their percentages of bioavailability, but for the most part, non-dairy milks are going to be just as bioavailable as cow's milk. There are certain number of cruciferous vegetables that are actually going to be higher bioavailability, and then tofu is about the same as milk, if not a little bit lower. Our Instagram account is Plant-Based Juniors, and just shameless plug too, all of the photos that you saw on the slides here today were from my website, Delish Knowledge. So if you're looking for any of those recipes in detail, you can find them there. All right, we're going to do a few more questions. There's a question here on urging individuals to focus on getting complete proteins by combining. That actually is not necessary. So I remember when I was in school, that was taught that we had to have certain protein combinations for plant foods to make sure we were getting a complete array of all of the essential amino acids, and you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to combine foods at certain meals. As long as you're eating a varied protein diet, you're going to make sure to get all of the essential amino acids. Okay, and then last question is advice for achieving adequate protein for kids with peanut or tree nut allergies. Yeah, great question. Thankfully, there are a lot of other options for protein intake when it comes to kids who have any kind of allergy. Again, thinking about all kinds of legumes, all kinds of beans, lentils, those are all going to be great sources of protein. So if your kid is allergic to soy, or allergic to different kinds of nuts, those are going to be great options. Tofu is another great one. And then again, if you're looking for like a nut butter, I really like sunflower seed butter. That tends to be okay with even some of the allergies. It's a really sort of nice way to include some nut butter without using things like almond butter, cashew butter, or peanut butter. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much, again, for attending today and for all of these questions. Again, I'd love to connect online on some of my platforms. If I didn't answer things that you want to make sure are addressed, go ahead and reach out to me there, and we'll make sure to get you covered. All right, thank you very much.
Alex, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your expertise with our audience.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And thanks to our audience for attending today and trusting Today's Dietitian as a source for your continuing education. Also, thank you very much to Simple Meals for supporting this program.
Instructions for credit claiming and downloading handouts should be up on your screen. You must complete a brief evaluation of the course in order to claim your credit and download your certificate. Registered dietitians should use code 175 when recording this activity in their professional development portfolio. If you are watching this webinar on our YouTube channel, please log into ce.todaysdietitian.com, click on the Webinars tab, and select this webinar in order to complete it for credit. If you are watching this webinar on our CE Learning Library website, click Next, or return to the course start page and select the evaluation step to complete this webinar for credit.